Hola, buen día. ¿Cómo están? Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides al segundo día del Coloquio Internacional SURGE 2023, Voces antirracistas no racialistas de los Estados Unidos, que ha sido coordinado por la doctora Olivia Gall del CEIICH. Ella es la coordinadora de SURGE y yo voy a tener el gusto de moderar nuevamente el día de hoy. ¿Se oye un poco mejor así? Ah, vaya. Entonces, ok. ¿Qué tal ahí? Ok. A ver, les decía que estamos empezando el segundo día del Coloquio Internacional SURGE 2023, Voces antirracistas no racialistas de los Estados Unidos. Es un coloquio que ha coordinado Olivia Gall del CEIICH y ha sido organizado, propiamente dicho, por Jimena Rodríguez Pavón de SURGE. El día de hoy tenemos como primer invitado, primer conferencista, al profesor Alan Goodman de Hampshire College. La conferencia que él va a impartir se llama en inglés From Biological Races to the Biological Consequences of Racism, Steps Towards an Anti-Racist Science and Society, de las razas biológicas a las consecuencias biológicas del racismo, el camino hacia una ciencia y una sociedad antirracistas. Entonces voy a hacer una breve presentación de la semblanza curricular del profesor Goodman e inmediatamente vamos a pasar a escucharlo. Alan Goodman es profesor de antropología biológica en el Hampshire College en Amherst, Massachusetts. Anteriormente se desempeñó como vicepresidente de Asuntos Académicos, decano del profesorado y decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Naturales de esta universidad, de este colegio. Goodman fue presidente de la Asociación Estadounidense de Antropología, la American Anthropological Association, o AAA, que cuenta con 11,000 miembros y es la organización profesional de antropólogos más grande del mundo. Él continúa codirigiendo el proyecto de educación pública de la AAA sobre raza y racismo, que incluye una exhibición museográfica premiada, un sitio en internet que se llama understandingrace.org y un libro, Race Are We So Different, que es este que tenemos aquí. Esta es la segunda edición del año 2019. La primera fue publicada en 2012. Los coautores de Alan en este libro son Yolanda Moses, que está aquí con nosotros, y a ella la vamos a escuchar hoy mismo por la tarde, y Joseph Jones. Y también Alan ayudó a redactar la declaración de la AAA sobre raza. Probablemente hoy nos va a contar un poco de este tema. Su libro más reciente es Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, que fue escrito en coautoría con Joseph Graves y que salió publicado en 2021 por Columbia University Press. La investigación de Alan Goodman en antropología biológica se centra en cómo la pobreza, la desigualdad y el racismo se insertan dentro de la piel. Aparte de las obras que ya mencionamos, es autor de más de 100 artículos y autor o editor de 9 libros, los que ya mencionamos y algunos otros. Entre estos otros están Genetic Nature Culture, en coautoría con Susan Lindy y con Deborah Heath, Nutritional Anthropology, en coautoría con Darna Dufour y Gretel Pelto, y también un libro que a mí me gusta muchísimo, Building a New Biocultural Synthesis, Political Economic Perspectives on Human Biology, en coautoría con Thomas Lederman. Él se doctoró en antropología en la Universidad de Massachusetts, fue becario postdoctoral en nutrición en la International Nutrition de la Universidad de Connecticut y en el Instituto Nacional de la Nutrición en México y ha sido investigador en fisiología del estrés también en el Instituto Karolinska de Estocolmo, Suecia. Alan, many thanks and the floor is yours.
translates to Mexico, and I hope that will be part of the question and answer. Voy a hablar en inglés, pero quiero entender preguntas en español o inglés. Okay. Okay. Necesito caminar. Okay. ¿Está bien? Oh, muy bien. Okay. So the title of my talk changed a little bit. It's Steps Towards an Anti-Racist Science and maybe Society as well. Some successes and acknowledging past individuals who've made efforts in anti-racist science where they have not succeeded, not due to their failures, but maybe where society was at that particular time, and the how the science was at that particular time, and maybe looking forward to future developments as well. So, la siguiente. Also want to warn everybody that I think this will be a long talk, so descanso. Okay, so some stories we've told quite a bit, especially in the United States. Siguiente. We've told a little bit about the history of race and racism, a lot of scholars. Next. We've told a little bit about the history of social struggles against racism, and siguiente. And siguiente. And the history of scientific racism, siguiente. But not so much about scientific anti-racism. So that's what I want to bring to light, is some of the struggles of past individuals and what they've done and not. So that's my focus. Thank you. Successes, failures, limits, gaps, and futures. Siguiente. So to start off with a little bit of grounding, question is, what is anti-racist science? And here's three things that I think are important. The rejection of the conflation that talking together about that race is the same thing as human biogenetic variation. Next, the rejection of the use of biogenetic race to explain inequalities. And next, to more moving forward, a focus on racialization and racism as real processes that get under the skin, cause inequalities in wealth, health, etc. Next. So why do I at least think science is important? Couple reasons. To understand human biological variation, we obviously need science. And also, I think science is useful for understanding the consequences of racism. Also, anti-racism has failed in part, I think, because it has avoided science. And next, science is necessary, but not sufficient for racial justice. Next. So, here's the history of scientific racism, successes and failures, next, in 5 easy steps. On this, the first is that John touched on is about Darwin and evolutionary theory. The second involves 4 individuals who are trying to talk about an anti-racist approach to human variation. Then Ashley Montagu and UNESCO in the middle of the 1900s, Richard Lewontin in genomics later on, latter part of the last century, and finally to Yolanda Moses and other individuals who have tried to do a public education to understand race. And also I have to give a nod to social epidemiologists who are trying to understand the consequences of racism for human health. Next. Okay, so here we go on our 5 steps. So number 1, we start with Charles Darwin in evolution. And why was Darwin important? For me, I think 2 things to say is that he provided a process, natural selection, to explain variation. Prior to that, the typology didn't have any process to explain variation. And also, in explaining variation, he thought of variation as being slow and gradual. The quote at the bottom is one that's people have talked quite a bit about. It's from The Voyage of the Beagle. If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sins. And one could read that and say, okay, Darwin was already aware in 1836 that human variation and consequences of life might not be so related to descent, but might in fact be related to conditions of life. But I think the body of his work is unclear about whether or not he had some sort of notion of social justice. Next. So what is typology that Darwin was sort of, I'm contrasting evolutionary theory to? Typology is kind of really intimately connected to the idea of race. Race is static, typological, and hierarchical, does not have a process. So race is something that explains itself, made by God or whatever. So race does not explain how variation arises. Next slide. So next. So Darwin and evolutionary theory, a potential advancement. Next. But it had little effect. A couple of reasons why I think it had little effect. Race at that time was seen as socially very useful, where he's writing at the time of slavery, of colonization, etc. Race is a useful kind of thing to believe in to justify racism. It's human sciences hadn't really developed. The social sciences and the natural sciences of study of humans. As I said, his commitment to racial justice is questionable. And I think kind of really importantly, there was no non-racial language to explain human variation. Next. So here are 4 individuals that I want to highlight. Franz Boas is coming off the screen a little bit. Frederick Douglass, Joseph Antonio Fermin, W.E. Du Bois, Franz Boas, all kind of voices in the wilderness that were writing anti-racist understandings, anti-race understandings of human variability, but without the language to really do so. Next. So Frederick Douglass, freed slave, very important in the history of slavery and emancipation in the United States, self-taught. And in 1984, he writes on claims of the Negro ethnologically considered, may not the conditions of man be explain their various appearances. And again, he's sort of getting that conditions of life might be what makes for differences in individuals, not some kind of pre-Darwinian understandings of inheritance. Morton, like some other people I'm going to talk about, is, I'd say, in reaction to other writings. And in particular, he's reacting to Samuel Morton's ranking of races based on cranial size and trying to look at the continuities of ancient peoples with contemporary peoples based on the size and shape of their skulls. And some people may be familiar with Morton, who is a Philadelphia physician, very, very important at the middle of the 1800s, and kind of in understanding the debates about monogenism and polygenism and things of that sort, and famously measured the size of skulls with buckshots and seeds. And later on, Stephen Jay Gould went on to critique his methodology and his results. Next. So great work, great insights by Frederick Douglass, but he was sort of a lone voice, had no data really to back him up, just as sort of, philosophical opinions and things of that sort. And again, no non-racial language. Next. Antonio Fermin was a Haitian kind of polymath, early anthropologist, man of letters, statesperson. And He just recently, his work on the equality of human races about 20, 30 years ago, it's kind of rediscovered as sort of an important early anti-racist tome. And he too is responding to somebody else, Count Gobineau, who writes on it should be the inequality of the human races. Sorry for the in got left off here. So next slide. Next. So, but, again, a limit here because of his small audience, no data, no non-racial language. Next. W.E.B. Du Bois, moving into academia a little bit in the United States. Famous quote, the problem of the 20th century is a problem of the color line. It's also 21st century as well in the United States. Du Bois was a Harvard-trained sociologist. Next. And, he was in the academy, had a larger audience, clear commitment to racial justice, and I think also brought a sociological perspective to understanding that race is related to culture. Next slide, please. But Du Bois, like the other individuals, also somewhat marginalized as an African-American in the academy. Racist eugenicist times began to spring up, especially eugenics, and I think that sort of overwhelmed, his voice. And again, no non-racial language. Next. Franz Boas, some people would call the father of American or North American four-field anthropology, is the first person to try to introduce real data, I would say. So he's got a larger audience. He's a professor at Columbia, former president, fourth president of the American Anthropological Association, had definitely a commitment to equity. He developed some data on plasticity and understanding continuous variation. Next. So this is just a slide of illustrating what we mean by continuous variation, that there's no strong breaks in variation from one individual or one group to the next. Next slide. And I wanted to show this because this is a slide that is from a reanalysis of Boas's famous study of changes in head size and shape, looking at European immigrants coming from Europe to the Americas. And it's a little bit complicated, but it's a principal components chart. Excuse the dorky science. The variation from left to right is variation mostly in shape, and from up and down is variation in, left to right is in size, up and down is mostly in shape. This is a graph by, come to me again, the name of the people who put this together, but it was a critique. But I want to say in the critique is actually, I think, a reaffirmation of Boas showing that racial types are not fixed. And so the arrows, if you can see, for instance, in the green, the arrow from the green square to the green circle are Sicilians looking at the change in Sicilian size and shape of their skull as they are European-born versus American-born. And then the red are Polish. I could have done this with others. Again, from the square to the circle, the change in size and shape as you move from European-born to American-born. This was really important in early 1900s, 1907, 1911. Boas began publishing these data. These are basically individuals coming through Ellis Island in New York, because it shows for the first time that the idea of racial types is not stable and introduces the term plasticity. And the plasticity or change by differences in environment in this particular case, it seems to be due to changes coming from probably an impoverished environment in Europe to a more possibly enriched environment in America. The last thing I want to say about this is if you look at it, the direction of the changes is very variable depending on the group. So it's not like everybody is developing the same size shape, but in fact tends to be a little bit of everybody kind of beginning to get similar size skulls. Okay, next. Yeah, so here's a famous picture of Franz Boas, and great work. But again, like Du Bois, he's writing in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, and this is a time of incredible rise of eugenics. And so that sort of overwhelms his voice, and still no real non-racial language. So one of Boas's famous books is Race, Language, and Culture, not human biology or human biological variation, language and culture. So he doesn't know how to talk about human biological variation. He has no words for it that are in fact non-racial. If you have no words for it, can you really overcome the idea that race is biological? Next. Okay, so to summarize where we're at a little bit, this is not quite the seventh inning stretch, but a little bit of stop here for a second. It's a baseball metaphor. Evolutionary theory is, unfortunately, could have been helpful, but is of little help against the status quo. I think John Marx might say part of the reason why is that nobody's believing in evolution. And that the individual voices are minoritized and on the defensive. They're mostly in response to other people. Next. And again, no non-racial language to describe differences. Next slide. So, John, to refer, if you were at this yesterday, also talked a little bit about this incredibly interesting and prescient individual, Montague Francis Ashley Montague, who just is an amazing individual. Born Israel Ehrenberg, Jewish in East London in 1905, learned about all he could learn in the UK, came to the United States, became a student of Ruth Benedict and Franz Boas, who was in the previous, and is, kind of one of the first public intellectuals in anthropology. And yeah, here, the picture over here, Montague, young individual, older individual. Montague receives Boas Award from two young admirers. This is John Marx and myself. Okay, next. So Montague's contribution, kind of mid-1900s, he's the first to argue against, one of the first to argue against racial differences in intelligence. And this is actually, a trope that just won't go away from Morton trying to measure racial differences in intelligence by skull size through to people like Philippe Rushton, who John referenced yesterday, still trying to do it based on some test scores or something of that sort. Montague was actually able to find some data on recruits to the Army, and in fact found out that if anything in the United States, there's a south to north gradient in intelligence test scores. Unfortunately, John, you're from North Carolina. You did less well than Hi and I from Massachusetts, or your groups did less well. But he used these data also to kind of fight against this notion that there are racial differences in intelligence. Montague is really the first person that clearly rejects race as a category for describing or dividing humans into groups. And what he does instead is he decides to talk just simply about ethnic groups. Next slide, please. A little bit of the advancement at this point in time is to try to understand that race if we think about race as skin color, has no deeper meaning. And for example, if you look at two world distributions of skin color and another trait, blood type B, skin color varies more or less, you know, in relationship to the amount of solar radiation, north-south gradient, but blood types is almost more east to west. And so there's really no concordance or relationship between the two of them. So next slide, and I'll try to explain what this means on a more theoretical level. So imagine for a second, you have four traits: skin color, hair color, type B, sickle cell, and look at four different groups or individuals by these kind of archaeological cores going down through. If you know what's on the top level, can you predict what's on the deeper levels? And basically, skin color, there's a little bit of relationship to hair color because they're controlled by some of the same genes, but have absolutely no relation to type B, sickle cell, size, or almost everything else. So next slide. So two traits are really vary with each other. They are not correlated or concordant. Skin color does not predict deeper traits. Next. And race is, in fact, in this sense, skin deep. Next. So Montague, like those other individuals, you know, has some limits. He's isolated, rejection of race in, I think, you know, problematically, ignored lived experience. So, you know, he is not separating out what I think is really important is race as a biological category versus race as lived experience and culture. And in fact, kind of his notions of ethnicity later become kind of quasi-racial and biologized. So in the literature, you begin to see lots of studies of the biology of this group or that group, and you know, where it's only an ethnicity. Next. The first really important international organization to weigh in on these questions about is race real and how is it real is UNESCO. And it does it in a big way in 1950, and Montague is very, very important here. If you can read the above, it's a UNESCO issued a statement asserting that race, in quotations, scare quotes, is not a biological reality, but a myth. So that's really important, but I'll say it's also didn't get us very far. Next slide. So for those in Mexico, I want you to know that of the 8 individuals who drafted the very important 1950 statement on race in Professor Juan Comas from Mexico, one of the deans of Mexican physical anthropology. And then at the bottom, our friend Ashley Montague, who's really, you know, as far as we can tell, was the engineer, the person who really put the statement together. The text of the statement was sent out to a lot of other people for comment and critique. And most of the people who wrote the statement, the 8 drafters of the Paris 1950 statement, would be considered social scientists. And a lot of the critiques that came in were coming from people in the biological sciences. Next slide, please. So the 1950 statement was great. It's well publicized in many major newspapers, kind of reprinted it, made it available to individuals. I should also add why 1950, post-Holocaust, understanding that, you know, that the United Nations, that the world had to do something about anti-Jewish racism and the Holocaust, and also about other conditions of racism in the United States and throughout the world. So well publicized, but, you know, not the statement we would write today. because it only suggests that race mixing is not detrimental. It doesn't say it's not detrimental. It suggests it might not be detrimental. It suggests lack of information to rank races on intelligence. And, it does say the myth of biological races has caused suffering. This is the first of 4 statements on race. Next slide. The subsequent 51 and 64 statements are the ones that kind of continue to kind of think about how race is or isn't biological. And I'm not going to go into these in great detail, but I'd say they backtrack instead of moving us forward. And especially, for instance, the 1964 statement, which is the last statement, included drafters like Carlton Kuhn, who is just I have to say, just a terrible scientific racist, just really out of step with his time. So, and then after 64, UNESCO sort of drops the science. They drop the ball on the science and move away, continue to fight racism, but not continue to involve science in that struggle. Next. So, moving a little bit up to the present next. So this is Richard Lewontin. And if you were at Jonathan's talk yesterday, talked a little bit about the important work that Lewontin did, and especially his incredible 1972 paper on the apportionment of human variation. Lewontin was an evolutionary geneticist. He had a very strong civil rights kind of social justice commitment, absolutely, undeniably, clearly so. He was at a powerful institution, Harvard, with a great network of students and colleagues. He had a voice. He wrote popularly as well as scientifically. Amazing individual. What did he find looking at blood group differences around the world? He found out, if you look at the first column, from the same population, that most of human variation is within a local population, and very little of it, if you look at the far, is variation that is continental, only 4 to 6%. So that was really a revolutionary study in 1972. So next. So Lewontin, in all senses, Montague should have, if you read Montague, in his 1942 Myths of Race, you might well say, okay, I'm convinced race is a biological myth. If you want to skip that and go forward 30 years in reading Lewontin, I don't see anywhere you could not say that. But he's still got a limited data set, just looking at mostly blood group polymorphisms. And race seems obvious phenotypically. I think that's one of the problems today, at least in the United States, as we go around and we say, oh, Black, Asian, Native American, perhaps, confused about that, Anglo. And the other thing is that, individuals try to marginalize Lewontin because he's an avowed Marxist, and that in the United States puts you on the outs in the academy, maybe not here, but in the United States, definitely. So next slide, please. Lewontin's work is not on looking at actual DNA sequences, the actual genome. That comes later on, but kind of continues the insights that Lewontin develops, only magnifies them, makes them even way, way more clear. And these are just, kind of famous pictures, cover of Time magazine, of the announcement of the sequencing of the human genome, and Craig Venter saying, what we've shown is a concept of race has no scientific basis. looked at 3 individuals. No, he actually didn't show that. But subsequent research does. Next. So a little bit of kind of just a pause here as well. So how do we think about the apportionment of human genetic variation today? What do we know about it? So I'll take you through a little bit of thought process. So imagine there are 3 races, as we frequently kind of get down to, continents: Asian, African, European. Poor Native Americans get left out. And that the genetic variation in each group is represented by a pie plate or a circle. Next. And so how much overlap would there be between the 3 pie plates or circles? So next slide. So this is an example of, graphically of what it might look like if there were no overlap, maybe even separate species, separate creations, or something of that sort. But, if you imagine individuals in each of these 3 groups, you could imagine an individual in the red European group, kind of that's closer to African, but for the most part, they're really quite separate and distinct. No question, these would be subspecies or something, even separate species. Next. Here's with some overlap, could say some ambiguity, where individuals in the middle might genetically look like they belong to one continent or the other. And next, here's with lots of overlap. And, so if you looked at that and thought about that in terms of human genetic variation, does it look like those have much meaning? Yeah. So, thank you for moving me ahead. Here's 3 different models, and which model is correct? Give you 5 seconds, and then I want to see hands. Okay, model number 1. Okay, guys, come on. Model number 2. Yeah, okay, 1 tentative. Model number 3. Yeah, okay. Next slide. So you guys would have, just to say, jump ahead. So model number 1 is probably, at Darwin's time, what most people would have voted for. If we had a Pew public opinion survey 170 years ago, that we would think that the races were either separately created by God or separately evolved, and, so entirely different. Next. Model number 2 is kind of a, what I think people like from Boas to Montague to Lewontin were really trying to argue against, because, I call this a phenotypic view. And if you look at skin color or hair form or something like that, it seems like you can kind of you have some ambiguity, but can separate it out. Model number 3, next, is actually based on Lewontin's study. So 1972, if you were here 51 years ago, you would have been correct. Okay, next. But we're not done yet. Next. So updating Lewontin, and this is one study that I find very kind of useful for its simplicity. So now we can look at single nucleotide polymorphism differences and really count them up between individuals. When we do that, that's part of what we find out, that individuals are 99.9% similar, that there's only one SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism difference per 1,000. Next. So what do we find when we look at single nucleotide polymorphism differences within continents versus between continents? So if you go from the bottom up, there's 25,000 base pairs, still a relatively small portion of the human nuclear DNA, but this has been replicated, and you find that there's about 15 differences between any 2 individuals from Europe, about 15 differences between any 2 individuals from Asia. Europe versus Asian, slightly higher, but I would say not, really significantly or importantly higher. If you look at EA, which is an Asian or European versus an African, you begin to get more variation. And then, but finally, if you look at the differences between two Africans, you get even more difference than you do between a European and Asian and an African. Next slide, please. So the mean differences is greater between two Africans than an African and a Eurasian. I want to repeat that. The mean difference is greater between two Africans than between an African and a Eurasian. So if that's true, is there a there to race? Next. And in fact, this is what really, John showed a version of this yesterday, the real variation in the human genome looks like is that the African genetic diversity, because we evolved in Africa, Africa is very diverse. We've developed the more genetic time for genetic diversity in Africa. Individuals that went out of Africa were subpopulation of Africans. So in fact, Asians and Europeans are really a subgroup of Africans genetically. Next. So because of recent evolution out of Africa, nucleotide diversity in non-Africans is essentially a subset of nucleotide diversity in Africans. And so in a sense, we're all Africans under the skin. Next. Yeah, so if you think about, next slide, what human diversity looks like, instead of having three groups, with some overlap or whatever, it's really, Africa is, we're all nested within Africa. Yeah. So what does explain the differences? There is world genetic variation, that if we look at a group from Athabascan, Inuit, or Icelanders, or Yorubans, we will find that they do differ. If you take a 23andMe ancestry test with ancestry informative markers, you can pretty well guess where somebody came from. But it's not race, it's location, 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 location. And so this is a graph that looks at the genetic distances between groups, and each dot is a pair of groups to look at how different they are. And you can see that there's almost a perfect relationship. As the geographic distance increases between the two groups, genetic diversity increases. Or say it the other way, as genetic diversity increases, geographic distance increases. Okay, next. So I'm going to sum up a little bit of why race does not equal human genetic variation. We started with evolution, and theoretically, race is static evolutionary processes, not race. Explain variation, not just natural selection, but genetic drift, for example, seems to be very important. I haven't talked about race in practice, though I could, but just to point out two things, that even if you believe race is not a really great way to describe human variation, but you think it might be useful, I would say no, because we know that, and this is part of being in Mexico, that who is described as being in one race or the other changes over time and place. Science 101, to a concept or measurement should be stable. There is no yardstick. There is no stability with race. It's culturally constructed and changed. I think Yolanda will get into this quite a bit when she talks about the census. And I think really importantly, when we use the same word race as a descriptor of human genetic variation and lived experience, we're then left with, say we're looking at differences in birth weights. We don't know is it one or the other? And I think that's the most important thing, is to know, what do we mean by race? And as I've talked about, race doesn't describe variation, because variation is continuous, trait to trait independent, and greater variation within groups versus among groups. Next. Okay. So I want to talk now about why contemporary genomics is still not enough to overcome scientific racism. And one reason is because many scientists hang on to biological race and fail to distinguish lived experience from genetics. Next. And I think an important point is that the public hasn't been educated. And so I would say they're kind of dazed and confused about, is race real? The big question is race real or isn't it real? Not how is race real or not real? Okay. So the last stage I want to talk about is a stage that incorporates both scientific education and social epidemiology. And I think in the United States, the first big effort at scientific education was, I think, a really, excellent documentary. I was in it, so I'm biased, called Race, the Power of an Illusion. Came out in 2003 by California Newsreel on public broadcasting, and it's still circulating through high schools and middle schools and colleges in the United States. So at this point, this is a documentary that's been seen by millions of individuals. And I think it did a great job of being 3 hours and really looking at race through race and racism through 3 different lenses: history, lived experience, and science. And those are the same lenses that in the American Anthropological Association Race Project, which kind of began even before this documentary came out, tries to sort of look at race as well. The other thing I'll say, if you back up for a second, about okay. This, I just want to take a pause on the title, Race, the Power of an Illusion, which I think is just a brilliant title to get at the notion that something can be made socially real and is real, because race can be an illusion or a result of racecraft, but still has real consequences in the world. Next slide, please. Next. Yes, applause. So the other thing I want to pay homage to is the American Anthropological Association's public education project. And picture of Yolanda here, who I think as much, if not more than anybody, has worked to get the public to understand what race is and isn't, to bring race and racism and our understanding of it out of the academy. And when Yolanda was president of the American Anthropological Association in 1997, she conceived of this project, and it took us a good 10 years to get it off the ground. But I think we got it off the ground in a very effective way by looking at different modes of public education, including an exhibit, award-winning exhibit, 3 copies of it still alive and well after 16 years in the United States, a website and book. This is that Paco mentioned in teaching materials. Next. So just an example of the website. You can see history, human variation, lived experience. Next. And the book, and one of the parts of the exhibit that I really like a lot is that stack of money is comparing to other stacks of money, which is the average wealth of of different group families in the United States that are of different races. And one gets to sort of see visually that European Americans have, give or take, 13 times the wealth of Latinx families and African American families. Next. So to turn a little bit to, so the other, I think, point of kind of anti-racism or anti-scientific racism is all of a sudden to try to think about whether or not racism itself versus race had impacts on health. And so here I put together, went to PubMed to look at the number of citations and two different kind of sets of keywords: race, genetics, and health, and then racism and health, and just went back from 2010 through 2022. And so if you look at the gray columns and see that the number of papers in PubMed, medical journal papers on that have these keywords, race, genetics, and health, actually increases from 2010 to 2022. Number of papers are increasing. There may be some critiques in here, but it's interesting that, a paper in 2022, there's still almost 1,000 papers in 2022 written that are on race, genetics, and health. And, so race, assumingly, is used as a genetic category. That's a little depressing. What I find interesting and less depressing is the rise in studies on racism in health, and especially how in 2010, there's hardly none. But if you go through time, and especially from 2020 to 2022, it's almost asymptotic, the rise in studies. And of course, since during COVID and the protests against the killing of George Floyd, et cetera. But the point here is that it's in the whole field of social epidemiology is beginning to try to understand how can we look at explicit and implicit racism and look at how its impact on the human body. Next. So anti-racism begins to spread. And we see signs of it. For instance, journals adopting policies on, defining what you mean by race. Some associations begin to release statements on race and racism. The American Association of Biological Anthropology did, I think, a very, very good one a couple of years ago. The American Anthropological Association did one a long time ago. Yolanda, we need to revise it. And also, I think there's increased attention to diversifying science fields themselves, I think is an important step. Next. So the question is there emerging scientific consensus on what race is? And I say maybe optimistically, yes, but there are definitely holdouts. Forensic anthropology is definitely a holdout area. Medicine, doctors, it's hard to, lawyers and doctors, terrible audiences, really hard to kind of deal with them. I mean, they've got their knowledge. They don't want to be challenged, so yeah, status quo is hard to overcome. But I think especially there's a huge gap right now between where scientists are understanding why race doesn't equal human genetic diversity and public lay individual understanding. So why does race, the notion of biological race persist? Next. The problem, I think, is mostly the public still doesn't understand what race is. And so while scientists may be reaching a consensus, public's dazed and confused. Census, what is your race? Next. And so a few data points. one of the problems is if you don't believe in evolution, then, who am I talking to? If you don't believe in evolution, you don't believe in the science of human variation. And so this is from a graph from Pew public, data gathering of U.S. individual beliefs in whether or not God created humans. And the bottom line is the one that said humans evolved, but God had no part in the process, reaches a high of 22%. And the top two lines are almost 80%, are that humans evolved with God guiding, or God created humans in their present form. So if that's what we believe in North Carolina, sorry for picking on you, John. It's going to be even harder to move the needle on understanding that race is not biological. Next. So this is a paper that's just coming out by a colleague of mine, Charmaine Royal, in which it's, I think, the first really good survey questionnaire of human attitudes to whether or not American attitudes to whether or not race is based in biology. And she divides this up between males and females, African Americans and European Americans, and by education. And basically, if you look from left to right, you can see a couple things going on, that African American women, especially better educated, are less likely to believe in the existence of biological races, and then go up to white men on the other end, and especially high school or less educated, almost 85% of high school less educated white men, or white men of any education, it's going to be 3 out of 4 or greater, still believe in the existence of biological race. So that's what I mean by public is way behind. I want to just say it's not just the United States. This is, I think, a global problem. Also, another paper just came out, and this is looking at European belief that some races are born less intelligent and hard working. Different countries, Portugal at the top, and somewhat surprisingly to me, the bottom scale goes from about 20% to about 70%. It got cut off, the white part. But that, for example, Portuguese, 70% are responding that some races are born less hardworking than other races. So again, not just that races are real biologically or not, but that there are some inherent differences in quality. Next slide. Letting the United States off the hook on that one. So I want to compare a little bit to, because this is, I think, an existential crisis, our, kind of belief in biological race. Racism is an existential crisis. Another existential crisis that we're probably more familiar with is climate crisis, climate change. So here we've got much better data comparing scientists and publics. So this is a 1914 study from Yale University that there's nearly consensus, 97% of climate scientists, maybe higher today, that believe that climate change is happening and it's human caused, but only 41% of Americans, so a huge gap. So climate scientists, next slide, are recognizing this and trying to develop educational programs to educate publics. I think we need to do much of the same. Also want to say attitudes vary and change. And so this is a look at science, amount of education in science and from low, medium, and high, and Republicans versus Democrats. Those are Coke and Pepsi. No, Democrats are a little bit more liberal. Republicans are increasingly going far right. But that you can see that there's incredible variation, especially in the Democrats, from low educated to high educated. 93% of high educated are getting it, that climate crisis is real. However, almost regardless of your level of education, if you're a Republican, you don't believe that climate crisis is real and human caused. So again, kind of an international comparison, slightly different set of questions. Public cause of climate crisis, the bluish colors are human or human and natural. And, you can see that there's lots of variation in this case. I think variation is good because if you're getting kind of an understanding of humans as causing climate crisis in one country, it shows that it could probably spread to another country. Maybe it can't spread from Democrats to Republicans, but maybe it can spread from Spanish to Indonesians. Okay, next slide. So why is scientific anti-racism not taken hold? I'm just going to compare it a little bit to global warming. Is there a scientific consensus? Global anti-racism getting there, maybe. Global warming, definitely. Do we have a lot of data to back up the science? I'd say in both we have lots. Public consensus, not for anti-racism, getting there almost for global warming. Do we have good educational efforts? Anti-racism, other than the two I've mentioned, very, very little. Lots for global warming. Are we good at tracking public opinion? Negligible in anti-racism, lots in global warming. Is this a visible problem? And I think that's important to think about. That increasingly people have talked about global warming as not being visible enough. I think it's increasingly becoming visible to many of us. And the problem of race is that the visibility is almost counterintuitive because we see phenotype and then we think we understand human genetic diversity, not. Last is institutions. In global warming, there are lots of powerful institutions involved and definitely not enough in anti-racism. Next. So, final thoughts. So scientific anti-racism is hampered by racial worldview, among other things. Race is, I think, even more so than global warming and belief in climate crisis. We're invested, we being individuals, powerful individuals and institutions from the United States, in believing that races are still sort of real and hierarchical, and that the extreme inequalities are not due to differences in circumstance, racism, but are actually due to something in the urban. Belief about biological races then are alive. They're varied. They're global. Next. And I'd say scientists need to firm up their consensus and be vocal. We really, really, scientists need to be talking to each other. And like climate crisis, we need much more global public education, extremely much more. So couple more final thoughts. It's my book with Joseph Graves. It's easier, I might just sort of pause on this. One of the things we need to recognize is how hard it is to change beliefs, how hard it is to change ideology. In the United States, we thought we could change laws and racism would go away. There would be racial inequality. Unfortunately, that's not true. Laws are important, but we can't just change laws. We have to change how people think, because how people think relate to institutional racism. And as next, can you go back for a sec? Yeah, and as long as biological race is believed, I pose that racial justice will not be achieved. Next.
Many thanks, Alan. Great talk. As we were saying before, como estábamos diciendo ayer, el tema es similar a lo que platicamos contigo hace algunos meses en el ciclo de conversaciones sobre raza, racismo y antropología biológica, que es una de las actividades que tenemos en SURGE. Pero creo que en esta ocasión tú profundizaste mucho más en varios puntos y esta relación con la problemática del cambio climático también creo que es un buen punto de comparación para ver cómo estamos en el tema del antirracismo con este apoyo en la información e interpretaciones científicas desde la antropología biológica y algunos otros campos que involucran la genómica médica incluso. Entonces, lo que nos toca ahora es tomar algunas preguntas del público asistente, así como lo hicimos ayer. Por favor, si pueden ir levantando la mano y vamos tomándolas. Y les vamos a pedir, como lo hicimos ayer también, que si es posible que se presenten brevemente su nombre, de dónde vienen, y así vamos procediendo. Por favor, aquí nuestro compañero de negro, que está a la mitad, si gustas.
Un favor a todas y todos. Vamos a hacer las intervenciones en el micrófono para que nos escuchen desde el YouTube. Y el profesor Goodman nos dijo que nos puede escuchar en español, pero podemos hablar pausado, mejor. También para las traductoras o hacer nuestra pregunta en inglés, tal vez. ¿Les parece bien si tomamos 3 y luego devolvemos la palabra? Son... Okay, esas 3, 4. Ya las vi, ¿eh?
Hola, me llamo Axel, del Instituto de Investigaciones Antropológicas. Mi pregunta va relacionada con, bueno, dio un recuento muy interesante sobre la parte científica, cómo se construye, bueno, en distintos momentos a través de los cuales se ha construido un discurso antirracista. Mi pregunta es pedirle que incluya ahí la perspectiva del activismo y los movimientos de la ciudadanía en esta discusión, porque también son parte importante, ¿no? De hecho, diría que la parte científica es una minoría en comparación con las acciones colectivas. Entonces, si puede incluir en algún momento o algún comentario sobre cómo van interactuando la ciudadanía, el activismo, dentro de estas luchas antirracistas. Gracias.
My name is Brian Becerra. Thank you so much, Alan Goodman. I am a PhD student and I am part of the Social Studies of Sciences at the Faculty of Sciences here at UNAM. Thank you for this brilliant and excellent explanations about what is no race, in my opinion, through the history. And you say race does not explain how variation arises, and I agree, and that there is no alternative language to explain human variation, and I agree. But this is an open question and a debate. What happened with the concept? We use the concept as a nation, as a color, as ethnicity, trade, etc. And recently, for example, SURGE and Olivia Gall and Francisco Vergara, for example, they say we can maybe use this new alternative biocultural human variation, for example. What do you think about these new concepts or new alternative or possibility? I'll be more radical. What do you think about eliminate the race concept?
sea, yo sé ahí, acá y acá. ¿Está bien? Vamos a hacer. 3 questions is okay, Dr. Goodman? Or, ¿dónde fue? Acá, allá y acá. Entonces, en este orden.
Hello, my name is Saul. I come from Facultad de Ciencias Políticas here at UNAM. And well, I like this conference so much. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge in this subject. And my question is related to you mentioned something about the genetics, about the human populations that we may have. You mentioned that genetic differences are more visible within the same group more than among different groups, and I think that I didn't get at all that that point that you mentioned. So if you could like recap this argument just to make sure that I understood this specific point, I would be so glad. Thank you very much.
Okay. So starting with the question about, all great questions, about, activism. I agree that science, doesn't come de novo, and, that in fact, as much as scientists are understanding activism and questions, about social justice, I think that becomes really important. I think we've seen a couple places where that's really quite true. To say Richard Lewontin's work, I mean, Richard Lewontin was very involved himself with the struggle for social justice for the Black Panther Party in the United States. And so, yeah, I think his ideas and his motivation, in fact, I mean, he's been accused of that politics influenced his science. Well, when has politics not, kind of influenced science? And that's as it should be. I think the second moment I'll point to is one of the slides of the increasing number of papers now that are looking at racism and its impact on health. I mean, that has been something that really has happened in the last few years as finally individuals in the United States have woken up out of their slumber to understand that racism is still very, very real. It has biological consequences. It gets under the skin. So, I apologize that I wanted to bring the science forward, but you're entirely right that the science is in context, and it's in context of public opinions, it's in context of activism. And I guess I'll say the last thing is that I've looked at this as scientists need to come to consensus, and then we may get a kind of a public consensus. And I think it may be that we're at the point where it's almost got to get reversed, that we need more public education. And the more public education we have about what race is and what race isn't, about the consequences of racism, may then get more scientists to say, I need to get out of my laboratory. I need to study this. I need to, understand it better. I'm going to come to you third because I'm not sure I totally got your question. The colleague in the back, and it's one of the things, it's nice to see individuals from so many different disciplines here. So the question is about, we're thinking about the apportionment of human variation. And, we tend not to think about variation as a measurable thing. So that's one of the issues in kind of trying to get this across. but that in fact you can measure how much variation there is between two individuals, two groups, etc. And so the question that Lewontin was really interested in is how much of that variation is statistically explainable by just local level amounts of variation, within an ethnic group or a small local group. And how much of that variation was variation within comparing different groups within a continent, and finally, different groups between continents. And I think at the time of his writing, 1972, we would look at people and say, well, most of that variation must be variation between continents, among continents, that seemed phenotypically to be the story that most people were telling. But when Lewontin looked at blood groups, those things that you couldn't see on the outside, he found remarkably quite the opposite, that most variation is within a group, not among groups or continents. Go a little bit further into the study by you that I showed that looked at genetic variation, that a very, very, very simple study, very, very simple concept. And that's why I like it and like as a teaching tool, that only 30 individuals was he looking at, 10 Africans, 10 Europeans, 10 Asians. And he just simply counted up between two individuals from Europe of the 25,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms. On average, how many differences would there be? Found 15. Two individuals, one from Europe or Asia, one from Africa. How much variation would there be? Found 20, a little bit greater. But at that point, I would say continent's not so very important. In fact, it's geographic distance that explains variation. But then the important point he found is that two individuals from Africa were even more different than an individual from Africa versus an individual from Europe or Asia. So suggesting that variation in Africa is really the greater variation, and this whole notion of different continental races is bogus. It just doesn't make any sense, that rather, we're all subsets of African diversity. I hope that helps, and thank you for a couple nods there, but I know it's a difficult way to sort of understand it, but just I think my mantra for you would be, on everybody, is just to try to think about the statement that two Africans are more different from each other genetically than one of them is from a European or Asian. Okay, so you might need to repeat your question. It was something about the race concept, and yeah. 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 Okay. I think so yeah, so Monty, so we had no language. I think we do now. We to describe human variation. I mean, now we have a lot of terms to describe it. We can look at geographic differences. We can look at specific biological or genetic traits and say, and so we don't need to talk about race. For example, if we're interested in sickle cell, we don't need to talk about race. We need to talk about sickle cell, who's got it, who doesn't, about the clinal variation in sickle cell, the complex variation in sickle cell. So I would call for the abolition of race in biomedicine, race as biology in biomedicine. I mean, it's just not necessary. The other thing I'll say is that as a biocultural anthropologist, I'm very interested in how culture and biology intersect. And in some sense here, I'm calling for divorce, that I think that when we talk about race, we need to talk about race as lived experience. We need to talk about processes of racialization and racism, and we can talk about the biological consequences of race and racism, but that's different than using it as a biogenetic problem. And I think I think a huge problem, at least in the United States, is that when we talk race, we don't say what we mean by race. And so my colleague Joe Graves, I think, is very, very clear that we'll never say race without kind of anterior word, biological race or social race. And I think that makes sense. I know that, yeah.
Hello, my name is Carmen. I'm not a student, but I want to ask a question anyway. I'm curious to know what you meant in the last bit of the presentation when you were comparing anti-racism to climate change. In the visibility part, you said that it was counterintuitive.
I'm sorry, say that again.
You said that the visibility was counterintuitive in regards to anti-racism. Yeah. And I'm not sure what you meant by that, and I'm interested to know.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por esta plática. ¿Más fuerte? Ajá, poquito más fuerte. Mi nombre es Paula López, soy investigadora del CEIICH, historiadora y antropóloga, y trabajo mucho en la historia de las tipologías de las que usted habla, cómo se institucionalizan. Y pues después de escucharlo y fascinarme con su presentación, intuyo que usted puede tener pistas a la pregunta que yo siempre me hago, que es ¿por qué, dado todo lo que nos ha explicado, los movimientos activistas antirracistas siguen apelando a todo este discurso? Digamos, que los racistas lo hagan no me sorprende, pero que los antirracistas sí, no deja de perturbarme. Y que además se descalifique como ilegítimo cualquier intento por cuestionarlo como negación del racismo, me parece muy problemático y bueno, no espero que me explique por qué, pero a lo mejor usted tiene algunas pistas, además de la responsabilidad de los científicos en la falta de difusión de nuestras ideas, que puedan explicar este problema social mayúsculo que tenemos. Pues. Muchas gracias.
Gracias por la conferencia, muy interesante. Yo tengo una pregunta, una observación. Soy María Elisa Velázquez, del Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, y trabajo sobre afrodescendientes en México. Hace un tiempo tuvimos aquí mismo un coloquio sobre racismo y deporte, y era muy impresionante que los investigadores que trabajaban desde la medicina y la ciencia seguían entendiendo la variación genética como con una óptica de raza, ¿no? Entonces, mi pregunta es, además de esta educación social, a mí me parece que hay un problema de un modelo económico que lleva por siglos inventando esta división de razas para tener la justificación de que hay grupos humanos que deben de explotarse, que deben de sujetarse frente a otros, ¿no? Unos son los que piensan, otros son los que corren, unos son los que trabajan en las minas, otros son los que hacen decisiones políticas. Entonces, creo que también en la medicina, que eso llama muchísimo la atención, que siga usándose la raza como un determinante que incluso los médicos le explican a uno. Creo que eso tiene que ver también con este modelo económico que sigue reproduciendo una noción que le funciona para desarrollarse. Gracias, muchas gracias por su exposición.
Si tienen alguna otra inquietud, vamos a devolver la palabra, nos la guardan.
So yeah, the point about okay, yeah. So to the point about counterintuitiveness, what I meant by that is that to change something, you need to see it. And so using climate crisis as a comparative, I wanted to say that a lot of scientists they could see climate crisis in their data, but the public don't see their data. But slowly the public is beginning to see polar bears on ice floes and glaciers falling into the water, or, you know, if you lived in the eastern part of the North America, eastern part of the United States, and experienced the summer hot and wet summer that we experienced, you begin to think, okay, I can see it. With human variation, which I think is also, you know, thinking properly about race and racism is equally a point of crisis. We see individuals, but we see them, at least in the United States, through a racialized phenotypic being outward, you know, what we see, skin color, hair color, texture, eye color, etc. And so what we're asking is for something that's counter what you intuitively think is real. Yeah. Which is that what your eyes see is actually not what genetic variation is. And I think that's a stumbling. That makes it kind of doubly difficult. Okay. Yeah. The question about, you know, the second question was, you know, a little bit about kind of activism and anti-racism and how I think it relates back to the concept of race. And this I think is a center point of maybe this whole conference. In the United States, and it's very clear to me, and I said this a little bit yesterday, that there's a very close connection, an intimate connection between the idea of biological race and racism. That they're synergetic, they're dialectical, and it's very, very clear that individuals who begin to understand the myth of biological race and the reality of racism, you know, are much better placed to fight for social justice. And in fact, in the United States, you know, there are some anti-racist activists, and maybe the same is true here, maybe even more so, that don't understand what race is and what race isn't. And I think that that's a problem, because we might want to explain inequalities as due to government policies, social policies, and I think we would all pretty much agree that that's absolutely true. It's how we treat each other is what determines inequalities in health, wealth, education, employment, etc. But if you've got somebody that can come in and say to you, oh, but aren't the races different in intelligence? Or look at the European data and say, I think races are born with different abilities to do hard work or different athletic abilities. And you can't come back and say, that's not true because of X and Y. Then you're just having an argument. And so I think ultimately the science is going to be important, understanding what race is and isn't. And, you know, from my humble opinion, you know, I think the US anti-racism has failed over and over again because of its inability for most people to understand what race is and isn't. Following that a little bit, I think and I may not get all of your question, all of the nuances of what you said, but there are some places where the belief of race as being, you know, genetically different persists, and medicine is clearly one hugely important place where this plays out. I think athletics has been another one where, you know, we, you know, see dominance of certain sports by individuals from a certain part of the world and say, okay, that must be due to racial genetics. And, you know, you have to read, there are some excellent books, including a couple chapters in the book I wrote with Joseph Graves on Racism, Not Race, which I think does a good job of debunking that. You know, and so, you know, we all may have these ideas in our mind of athletic superiority. I'll say, what country has won the most Olympic medals per capita? Anybody want to take a guess? What? America, not per capita. Yeah, Finland. Yeah. And, you know, and what country has won no gold medals? Uganda, so, where do, at this point, where do great middle and long distance runners come from? They used to come from Finland. Some came from the UK. Now they come from East Africa. The genetic differences between East Africa and West Africa are humongous. They're not the same genetic groups. So we need to break this apart. Medicine, I've got colleagues that are really looking at, how we think about race in the United States. I had a bone density test a couple months ago. One of the questions I was asked was, what race am I? And it turns out how I answer that question affects whether, where my bone density looks or my estimated risk of fracture. I, routinely will ask the person who administers the test and ask me my race. Could you tell me why? And, usually I get, I have to, or it's a question. But race is so baked into biomedicine. It's, going to be it's baked in there. It's in the, I don't want to use the metaphor of DNA, but it's in the blood, it's in the DNA, and it's really, really hard to get it out of there. And what we're finding, there's a ton of tests that you take in the United States and to determine, say, whether or not you're anemic, your blood measurements to determine whether or not you're considered anemic vary depending on your, in quotes, race. And so we're finding over and over again, but if there's so much variation within any race, then between races, how does this make sense? And so finally, slowly, one of these race-specific diagnostic tools is being replaced with a non-race specific diagnostic tool.
Decía que les agradecemos muchísimo su presencia. Estas 6 preguntas han sido excelentes, creo que nos permiten profundizar muchísimo en el contenido de la plática del profesor Goodman. Yo quería hacer una observación, me llamó mucho la atención, me parece que es así como todas las demás, una excelente intervención la de María Elisa, porque el tema del modelo económico ya lo estábamos platicando ayer. Yo quisiera introducir nada más, como empezamos ayer, el asunto de que también la información científica de la que nos ha hablado Alan hoy, que se publica en las principales revistas internacionales, el modo en que funcionan esas revistas está vinculado con el modelo económico también. Entonces, yo estoy de acuerdo en que, por ejemplo, aquí, para nombrarlas por su nombre, ¿no? Wiley, una editorial norteamericana muy importante que se comió a Blackwell, que era británica, son quienes editaron el libro, pero digamos que es una excepción, podríamos decir, en cierto sentido, porque las grandes empresas que publican estas revistas como Nature y Science, por ejemplo, suelen moverse hacia aceptar predominantemente artículos que siguen de alguna o de otra manera manipulando esta noción de el continente europeo, que corresponde a una identidad racializada, y África también, etcétera. Entonces esto es algo que también tenemos que analizar como parte de todo lo que ya estamos viendo en el coloquio. En particular en los Estados Unidos es uno de los países donde principalmente nos hemos dado cuenta, que nos hemos fijado un poco en este proceso, que esto ocurre. Entonces, para que no se malentienda lo que estoy diciendo, por supuesto que hay muchas otras publicaciones a revistas científicas donde se publican resultados mucho más matizados. También es publicación científica, pero no tiene la misma importancia necesariamente que un artículo de una revista de impacto altísimo, de decenas de puntos de impacto, ¿no? Entonces, el proceso mismo de la publicación de estos artículos que están vinculados con la antropología genómica, la genómica médica, antropología molecular, ha habido muchas maneras en que estas interacciones disciplinarias se han ido nombrando en los últimos años. Esa parte también forma, creo yo, este círculo de procesos alrededor del modelo económico que hacía muy bien María Elisa en recordarnos. Entonces, a partir de esto, creo que había más preguntas en el público y no sé si las vamos a tomar ahora. Si quieres, ahora Jimena, por favor.
Sí, muchas gracias, Paco. Olivia, y si alguien más, por favor, levanten la mano y vamos.
Sí, bueno, me presento, soy Olivia Gall, soy también investigadora del CEIICH y la coordinadora de SURXE. Creo que esta conclusión, primero agradezco enormemente esta plática, como la de ayer, es de una calidad que de verdad me llena de alegría de tenerlos a ustedes como invitados, y Yolanda no se quedará atrás hoy en la tarde. Por favor, escúchenla en el auditorio del CEIICH porque vale muchísimo la pena. Entonces, la conclusión de que tenemos que pelear contra la noción de que la raza es un ente biológico, ¿no? Me parece fundamental, sea dentro de las ciencias de la vida, digamos, o médicas, o dentro de la sociedad, ¿no? Ahora, yo estoy leyendo el libro de Race Not Racism, y una de las preguntas que ustedes hacen es, ¿qué es una construcción social o una construcción cultural? Y, digamos, cuando ahora hay un acuerdo por ejemplo, en México, en el campo social de las humanidades o en el activismo, hay como un acuerdo, por lo menos verbal, de que la raza es una construcción social o cultural. Hay ese acuerdo, pero
¿qué significa una construcción social o cultural? Lo que nosotros decimos es que esa construcción tiene que ser situada, porque no es lo mismo la construcción social o cultural o política de la raza en Estados Unidos, y es por eso que el movimiento antirracista en Estados Unidos dice, si nos consideramos raza negra o raza Native American o raza, no sé, para pelear contra el racismo, porque la construcción social y cultural en Estados Unidos de la raza es algo que todo el mundo reivindica, no solo los racistas, también los antirracistas. Y en esa sociedad es válido porque la historia ha sido así. Ahora, en otras sociedades, la construcción social y cultural de la raza no funciona igual. Ayer hablábamos muchísimo sobre eso. Y entonces, ¿qué hacemos con eso? ¿No? Un poco lo que decía Paula, ¿qué hacemos con eso? Porque hoy en México estamos peleándonos en el ámbito social y activista. Por decir, sí, pero no lo veamos como una construcción social o cultural global. No hablemos de global race como si fuera, black is a global race, ¿no? Black race is a global race, pero no creemos que sea así, porque la negritud y la forma en la que se construyen las poblaciones afros dentro y fuera de África es muy distinta de unos lugares a otros, ¿no? Entonces, estamos en esa lucha y pregunta en México, ¿qué hacemos con eso? Como construcción social, también tenemos que pelear porque no se fundamentalice, porque sí se está fundamentalizando. Perdón que me extienda, pero otra cosa que en México está pasando es que una parte del activismo insiste en que tenemos que empalmar color de piel con raza y que a fuerzas, y que es una lucha política correcta. Y muchos de nosotros estamos en contra. Y la tercera cosa, muchos estudiantes de ciencias sociales consideran que no es importante saber lo que pasa en el ámbito de la ciencia. Y creo que también tenemos que, por eso hicimos este coloquio, la ciencia, yo difiero, no es una pequeña parte de lo social, está imbuida en tantas cosas que en la sociedad se creen, se piensan, se dicen. No sé, Alan, ¿qué piensas de esto? Gracias.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Bueno, yo soy Eric Valencia, bueno, estoy estudiando antropología aquí en la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas de la UNAM, y bueno, mi pregunta va igual relacionada un poco en esta parte del activismo y la academia, ¿no? Es decir, bueno, aquí, bueno, se nos ha enseñado mucho esta parte de que la antropología mexicana, que bueno, es en donde yo me encuentro, es mi contexto, nace como una ciencia que va a ser aplicada, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, existe mucho esta relación entre sociedad y ciencia, en la cual la academia a veces, si no es que, bueno, en mi caso yo creo que es la mayoría de las veces, se distancia un poco de esta sociedad, ¿no? O sea, nos partimos de un punto en donde la ciencia se encuentra dentro de un puesto de la jerarquía mucho más alto de lo que es el resto de la población. Entonces, bueno, yo me pregunto, incluso fuera del activismo, porque en ocasiones es mal visto dentro de la academia, ¿cómo podemos, o bueno, cómo usted ha roto esta brecha, ¿no? Que se ha formado entre sociedad y academia, porque bueno, tal como vienen diciendo, bueno, o sea, es una brecha que yo veo como algo imaginario, porque en realidad no existe esa brecha. Creo que la propia academia la ha formado y nos hemos separado de las demás personas. Entonces, en Estados Unidos, si le pregunto a usted, o sea, ¿cómo ha manejado esta parte de los estudios que ha hecho usted con respecto a cómo los aplica? Porque la educación no siempre, en cuanto a escuelas, no siempre es la respuesta. Digo, nos vemos imbuidos en tantos contextos que usualmente aquello que vemos en las escuelas no siempre es lo más importante para nosotros y bueno, nosotros en general. Entonces le pregunto, bueno, ¿cuáles han sido sus respuestas? Y es eso en general. Muchas gracias.
Just one more, please.
Hi, my name is Mario Bella, and I come from the Faculty of Sciences and also a couple years ago from the National School of Anthropology and History. And my question is about, is it possible to escape racial typology in forensic identification? And how can we better ask questions, scientific questions that seriously take theory, evolutionary theory, and avoid assumptions and the use of statistical measures on the so-called biological distance as a one-on-one relation on culture, identity, and population? Because it is a problematic issue that comes around every couple of years, that forensic scientists really have issues on these themes on biological distances.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to take these in reverse order, giving me more time to think about Olivia's questions or her provocations. So I think you're asking about escaping racial typology, maybe asking better science questions, and and forensic anthropology. I'll start, I guess, with forensic anthropology, that at least as it's done in the United States, and then maybe broaden out a little bit. And this really gets also an example of the relationship between science, government, society, etc. So if you discover a body of a disappeared, or, and you want to know who that person is, if you're in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigations oversees this process, and they have a form you need to fill out. And that form includes what you think the age of this individual was, what you think the biological sex of this individual is, how tall were they, and what was their race. And that's been in use. It's in use now. It's in use forever. One of the first things I did when I started studying science and race is I went back and I was curious about whether or not checking race worked. And to cut to the chase, I found that any study that retested the methodology, the results were no better than random, meaning that if you assign, in this context, it was usually Native Americans, African Americans, and European Americans, and that your chance of being correct was about 1 chance in 3, which was a coin toss, no better. Why was this so? This is so because who is Black in California looks very different from who's Black in Massachusetts. Who's Native American in Manitoba is very different from who looks Native American in Florida. We're looking at differences in samples over time and place. And so this gets to the fluidity, not just of social definitions of race, but the actual kind of, the classifications itself. So what do we do? And again, I don't want to say I have the answers, but a couple potential directions. I think if we're interested in human biological variation, say, what are the genetic risk factors for chronic heart disease, then study the genes. You know, there's no need to study races. Study the things you're interested in. Study the things that you understand that there may be a process by which this gene may code for X or Y, and this may be implicated in the pathogenesis of chronic heart disease. You know, I think there, again, abolish race as biology from biomedicine. If you're interested in the consequences of growing up in a racist society on health, do it. You know, and what we need to understand, I mean, we know in the United States, we'll talk about the census, and we're great at collecting data by race. We do it in the census, we do it in housing, we do it in healthcare, we do it in education. And that's important, right, in and of itself, because with those data, we can understand very, very clearly how deep the racial differences are in, for instance, infant mortality. In the United States, infant mortality differences between African Americans and European Americans, African American rate is 2.2 times greater than the European American rate. And the European American rate is not anything to be particularly proud about. Maternal mortality of African Americans is 3 to 4 times higher still than European Americans. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is to understand the processes by which, how is it that these medical inequalities are coming about? And, you know, that's racisms. And how does racism get under the skin? Interesting recent book by Arlene Geronimus in a concept called weathering, just to give an example, is she's talking about how growing up in a racist society is like weathering a roof or shingles or something like that. It's daily, day after day after day after day. And one of the things she finds is, for instance, we tend to think early births are more risky, but with African American women, it tends to be later births that are at higher risk because of the cumulative effects of weathering of living in a racist society. So I think, you know, this work in social epidemiology that trying to understand different ways to not just, you know, look at the raw data about differences in, say, health between different racialized groups, but to really understand explicit racisms, implicit racisms, you know, and things of that sort, I think is really great. And so, you know, again, 2 different directions. In biomedicine, study the genes you're interested. If you're interested in social medicine, you know, then, you know, begin to kind of track those. How do you measure racism is, I guess, the question. So looking at my notes, there was the question about the divide between society and academics, between activism and academics, and, you know, I guess how to make, you know, the academic studies and a little bit more, at least relevant and to society, I would say, is really important. And again, I maybe give a bad example, and then I'll try to think about a good example. The unfortunate example, it comes from skeletal biology, and, you know, a field that I'm very intimately related to. My esteemed colleague Lourdes Marquez and her students have done incredible work in Mexico and looking at ancient and colonial period populations, looking at their bones and understanding political economic dynamics and things of that sort. So there's a lot of great looking at bones and teeth and paleoepidemiology as a field, the health in the past. But in the United States, a law called NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was passed in the 1990s. And along with that law, we began to understand who owns the ancient human remains. And back in 1990, a lot of my biological and physical anthropology colleagues were like, no, science is important. I need to study those bones, and I can't give them back to those individuals for which those bones were their ancestors.